The news hit like a thunderclap. Boeing, a symbol of American industry, halted its main assembly lines. On September 15, 2025, a critical shortage of components, triggered by a sudden export ban from Beijing, brought production to a standstill. The silence in Boeing's Everett factory was more than the absence of machinery. It was the sound of a global supply chain snapping. This wasn't a labor dispute or a minor hiccup. It was a calculated geopolitical move, the result of years of rising US-China tensions. For decades, American companies like Boeing relied on China for parts, chasing lower costs and bigger markets. Now, that relationship had become a weapon, and Boeing was the first major casualty. Stark images of empty parking lots and unfinished fuselages filled the news, symbolizing a seismic shift in global manufacturing. The shutdown exposed deep vulnerabilities in American industry. Had the drive for efficiency left critical sectors dangerously exposed? Social media erupted with fear and confusion. How could a decision in Beijing bring an American icon to its knees? The event quickly transcended business news, sparking national debate about economic sovereignty. The Boeing shutdown was a wake-up call, forcing a reckoning with the risks of global interdependence. It wasn't just about one company, it was about the future of American manufacturing. The silence on the assembly lines was a warning. The foundations of globalization were not as solid as we believed. The nation was forced to confront hard questions about resilience, security, and the true cost of outsourcing. Wall Street reacted instantly. Boeing stock plunged over 20%, erasing billions in value. The shock rippled through the Dow Jones and the entire aerospace supply chain, dragging down suppliers from Kansas to California. The market wasn't just punishing Boeing, it was pricing in a new risk, that geopolitics could cripple any major US corporation. The VIX, the so-called fear index, spiked, signaling panic. The shutdown threatened 150,000 Boeing jobs, but the impact was far wider. For every Boeing job, 10 more depend on it. Local diners, machine shops, logistics firms, all felt the tremors. Unemployment claims surged in Seattle and other manufacturing hubs. Consumer confidence dipped sharply, reflecting the anxiety spreading through communities. The numbers on the stock ticker weren't just abstract, they meant lost paychecks and shuttered businesses. The Boeing crisis showed how a corporate shock can become a regional disaster overnight. The event forced Americans to realize how deeply their livelihoods are tied to global supply chains. The Main Street earthquake was just beginning. The consequences were real, immediate, and personal. Beijing's response was swift and unapologetic. At a global press conference, China's Ministry of Commerce made it clear. The export ban was retaliation for new US tariffs on Chinese goods. This wasn't a rash move, it was a carefully planned strategy. Trade data showed China had been quietly reducing shipments of non-critical parts, testing the waters before the final ban. By targeting Boeing, China struck at both a symbol of US manufacturing and a key defense contractor. The message to American companies was unmistakable. Dependence on Chinese supply chains is a vulnerability. China's move aimed to divide the US business community and pressure Washington to soften its stance. It was economic statecraft at its sharpest, turning globalization's strengths into weaknesses. Internationally, allies expressed concern and the WTO called for restraint. But behind the scenes, countries began reassessing their own supply chain risks. China's action became a global case study in economic leverage. The world saw the dangers of over-reliance on a single country for critical components. The Boeing shutdown sparked a worldwide conversation about resilience and diversification. The era of business as usual was over. The rules of global trade had changed overnight. The shockwaves would be felt far beyond aerospace. To understand this crisis, we must revisit 4 decades of US-China economic ties. In the 1980s, American companies flocked to China for cheap labor and new markets, launching a new era of globalization. The hope was mutual benefit: cheaper goods for Americans, profits for corporations, and modernization for China. When China joined the WTO in 2001, outsourcing accelerated, made in China became the norm. Boeing was at the forefront, integrating Chinese parts to access the booming Chinese aviation market. But deep integration brought hidden costs: intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and a ballooning trade deficit. Millions of US manufacturing jobs vanished, while China built up its own industries, often in direct competition with its Western partners. The relationship evolved from simple outsourcing to strategic rivalry and codependence. The seeds of the 2025 crisis were sown in these choices: efficiency and profit over long-term security. By offshoring critical manufacturing, the U.S. handed leverage to a strategic competitor. The Boeing shutdown is the consequence of these past decisions. It's a stark lesson in the risks of prioritizing cost over resilience. The globalized strategy that once seemed unstoppable now looks dangerously fragile. The tangled history of U.S.-China manufacturing has reached a breaking point. The past has come back to haunt the present. The Boeing shutdown sent shockwaves far beyond aerospace. Auto executives warned that a similar supply disruption could halt car production for months. The crisis exposed the fragility of supply chains across manufacturing, from electronics to pharmaceuticals. Tech giants like Apple saw their risk profiles reassessed. What if Beijing restricted lithium exports for batteries? The U.S. Geological Survey had already warned China processes over 60% of the world's lithium. Even the pharmaceutical industry faced scrutiny, with lawmakers asking what would happen if China cut off key drug ingredients. Boardrooms across America scrambled to map their supply chains, searching for hidden vulnerabilities. Companies considered expensive strategies like reshoring and building up inventory. The era of lean, just-in-time manufacturing was suddenly under fire. The Boeing crisis forced a national reckoning with decades-old dependencies. In Washington, the Boeing shutdown triggered emergency meetings and bipartisan alarm. The president promised swift action to restart Boeing's lines and protect American jobs. The government scrambled to find alternative suppliers, but the task was daunting. Congress erupted. Some demanded tough retaliation, others warned against escalating the trade war. Behind the scenes, diplomats raced to negotiate with Beijing. But China held firm, demanding U.S. concessions. The crisis exposed the limits of American leverage in a world where economic interdependence is a weapon. Lawmakers fast-tracked bills to boost domestic manufacturing and secure supply chains. The conversation shifted from free trade to economic resilience. The Boeing shutdown forced policymakers to rethink America's industrial strategy. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were urgent and real. Washington was learning the hard way that resilience can't be built overnight. The heart of the crisis was the complexity of modern manufacturing. A Boeing 787 relies on hundreds of suppliers worldwide, designed for efficiency but lacking redundancy. The shutdown exposed the Achilles heel. For some critical parts, there were no quick alternatives. Components like advanced composites and avionics aren't off the shelf. They require years to source and certify. Allies like Japan and Germany had limited capacity. Reshoring production to the U.S. would take years and massive investment. The just-in-time model left no buffer for disruption. The supply chain wasn't just disrupted, it was broken. Companies now face hard choices: hold more inventory, diversify suppliers, or invest in domestic production. The once invisible supply chain is now a frontline issue in business and national security. The Boeing shutdown is a brutal lesson in the cost of efficiency without resilience. The world is rethinking how and where things are made. The most painful impact of the shutdown was on people. Within days, Boeing issued layoff notices to 50,000 workers. Suppliers followed with their own cuts. The economic shock rippled through communities. Food banks were overwhelmed, unemployment offices flooded. For many, the loss was more than a paycheck. It was a blow to identity and pride. Skilled, well-paid jobs vanished overnight, exposing the vulnerability of workers in a globalized economy. The crisis showed that even the best jobs aren't safe from distant boardrooms or foreign governments. The human cost was immediate and devastating. The abstract forces of globalization became heartbreakingly real. The Boeing shutdown was a stark reminder: economic decisions have personal consequences. As of September 19, 2025, the future is uncertain. The Boeing shutdown has exposed vulnerabilities decades in the making. The crisis forced a national conversation about manufacturing, security, and America's role in the world. The era of assuming global supply chains are safe from geopolitics is over. A targeted export ban has crippled a cornerstone of U.S. industry with ripple effects across the economy. The government's options are limited. Rebuilding resilience will take years. This may be a turning point, the beginning of a shift from efficiency to resilience. The long-term consequences for trade and global relations are profound and unclear. Is this a temporary crisis or the start of a new economic Cold War? The assembly lines are silent, and the world waits to see what comes next.